Hello and welcome to the IEA channel. I'm Emma Reffel, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and today I'm joined by Nick King, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, for another look at the Levelling Up agenda. Nick has recently co-written a paper with Jake Berry, Conservative MP for Rosendale and Darwen, former Northern Powerhouse Minister and Chair of the Northern Research Group, which called for a Northern Big Bang, which should, in their words, unleash a torrent of investment into the Northern economy to deliver the productivity gains, economic growth, and higher wages that are so desperately needed. Hi, Nick. Welcome. Thanks very much for joining me today. For our viewers and listeners who haven't had a chance to read your report in full, which I recommend they do, and we will put a link in the show notes, can you just give us a brief overview of what you and Jake see as the problem and the solutions that you're proposing?
Yeah, sure. The problem is one that I think is well rehearsed. There's a massive performance gap and economic output gap between London and South East in particular and the rest of the country. We've looked at that performance gap particularly through the lens of the North, which is where myself and Jake, and indeed yourself, Emma, are all from. So we feel it particularly keenly. I think actually lots of the lessons that we then seek to apply to the North could actually be applied right across the country. So recognising that there is this long-standing gap, a historic performance gap between London and South East and the rest of the country, we try to come up with a set of recommendations which we think can address that and bring the economic performance of the North higher and improve economic output. And our sort of central thesis in doing that is that we need to unlock and unleash private sector investment. We know that over successive decades, successive governments, lots of different initiatives have been tried. I was talking to one of the Northern mayors earlier today. He told me that there have been over 50 different initiatives that they've counted in the last 25, 30 years. Clearly, none of them have worked because the problem, if anything, has been getting steadily worse rather than steadily better. And so we think that we need to try to do something different. And we think the most important and substantial change that we can make is unlocking private sector investment, which ultimately is what's going to drive jobs, growth and opportunity across the North and indeed across other bits of the country.
I mean, as you just said, your ideas are designed to drive private investment in the North, which recognises that a large part of the levelling up narrative has been around public spending. And this isn't usually the best way of doing things. You know, that's what the IEA would say and the Centre for Policy Studies. Do you think this is something the public understand? Or do think tanks like ours need to make the case that just because government isn't using taxpayers' money for a project, that's no bad thing? Or do they expect money from government as the way to level up?
Yeah, well, we probably need to work harder to make that argument. I think, ultimately, most members of the public do understand that. But the easy answer, and indeed the easy answer on behalf of government and people in government, whether on the political side or the civil service, is often to spend more. And it is it's in some ways, although it relies on trying to bring in money from taxpayers and then redistribute it, it's the most obvious lever and set of tools that policymakers have got, and so it's the one that people often therefore call for. But as we know, there's a limit to that, and there's also an impact for that, and particularly at a time like this, where we're thinking hard about how we can generate growth and bring about economic recovery, and increasing taxes to spend them in certain parts of the country is going to choke off any prospect of recovery. So we need to be very careful about using that lever. But I think it is just instinctively one that a lot of people reach for because it's the easiest one to pull.
It's as much about persuading civil servants and Whitehall not to spend taxpayers' money as it is the public, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's right. And dare I say, not just civil servants, it's also MPs and ministers. It's often kind of called not just of the opposition, but indeed of MPs from the party of government to say, you show you care by spending more money here. I'm not saying there isn't, clearly there's a role for public spending on public services, but there is a limit to how much it can really do.
One of the big features of your report is the idea that the North could become a powerhouse behind the UK's drive to reach net zero by 2050. The argument being that it's part of the country with a rich history of industry and manufacturing, and places like Newcastle or Grimsby could replace old sectors that are declining or indeed have completely gone with new ones, relatively, future-proof jobs if we're going to meet the net zero target. Do we have evidence that, the regions are looking for this? Are there specific regions that are already ahead on the green agenda, bringing it to parts of the north?
Yeah, I mean, I'd point particularly to the work that Ben Houchen's doing in the Tees Valley. I just think there's been an extraordinary story there over the last few years, and really demonstrates that if you get the right figurehead for a particular area, they can drive results. And what Ben's done that's been particularly smart, of course, he's worked with government and he's shared his ambition there with government, which is willing to back him. But really what he's been doing is doing exactly what we're talking about in this paper, which is unlocking the private sector and getting the private sector to invest in the region and in the sorts of technologies that we're talking about that are going to drive our net zero ambitions in the future, and at the same time bring about jobs and growth in a part of the country that desperately needs them.
The paper argues that, as well as the economic benefits of levelling up that I think we all understand, this government in particular has a duty to do so, because the size of their majority came off the backs of northern voters saying, we're fed up of being left behind, we want to see change and we think you can deliver it. Do you think that means we're more likely to see actual concrete policies to tackle regional inequality? Is Boris Johnson going to be the man who actually delivers? I mean, after all, as you said at the beginning, we've been talking about levelling up for 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. But do you think this government, because it has a political, drive to do it, means that we'll actually see more progress than we have in the last, say, decade?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's a big unknown, isn't it? And for reasons outside of their control, there isn't as much to define the levelling up agenda at this point as we might like. It's whatever it is, 15 months on from the election. Yeah, they've done some things and they are saying some things, but COVID's come along and it's knocked, not the whole globe for six. So, it's understandable, but it means that there's catching up to do. And indeed, COVID, if anything, makes the situation more urgent.
I was going to say, people have said that the areas of the north of England have been more affected by COVID because of, the regional inequalities. So yes, it's probably delayed policies to rectify that. But at the same time, it's made it more important that in the coming months and years, we do something about it.
Definitely. And I mean, it's partly existing inequalities. I think it's also the industrial base that exists there. And it's much easier for people in service economies, even in think tank worlds, to still operate sitting behind a screen. It's less feasible where there's a strong manufacturing base, and that's something which they're having to contend with. So I think, the situation is more urgent, and it remains to be seen whether or not this government will be able to put in place the sorts of steps, sorts of measures which are really going to make a difference. But I do think the political imperative you talk about is important, and we've deliberately framed that report in that context because it's something which we are told matters a great deal to the Prime Minister personally, and to this government. So I think it gives them an added impetus, and hopefully that will be one of a number of things which will mean that this time is different, because as you say, this is not the first government that's thought it's an important agenda, but it's got to be the first government that cracks the nut.
Probably won't be the last either. It's not something that's going to be solved in the next in the remainder of this parliament, I suppose.
No, I think that's a really good point. And politicians always held to an impossibly high standard, aren't they? But I mean, I took part in some event last week, and people say, well, the government hasn't levelled up in the last 12 months elected. Well, they've had one or two other things to deal with. But even if they put everything in place, I mean, that is not going to be job done come 2024. So this is a long-term horizon. Investment is a really, really important part of it, but I don't pretend that is all there is to it. Talking about long-term structural change, that's got to rely on education and social fabric. So there's loads more to this, and a lot of those things will take many years.
Exactly. I mean, this is a problem that hasn't appeared overnight, and it's not going to disappear overnight either. Keir Starmer made a speech today setting out Labour's plan for the economy and said that the Conservative plan to level up, and this is a quote, was a few sound bites and the odd photo opportunity. Do you think that all parties need to stop talking and start doing when it comes to regional inequality?
Great question. Well, yes. I mean, it's nature of politics. A lot of it is about talking, and a lot of it is about point scoring, and it's frustrating. I take take the ironic point that I work at a think tank, so I'm talking about these things, but yeah, I mean it's got to be about delivery, and central government obviously has a huge role to play there, but so do local authorities, local enterprise partnership, mayoral combined authorities. It's all got to be about doing, and I think it's a shared requirement basically.
We mentioned just a minute ago that, seeing the results of any levelling up agenda is going to take years and probably decades. But what do you think are the sort of maybe top one or two things that will, from your and Jake's report, that will have the most immediate impact on the north of England? Is there one or two you could pick out that go, if you were going to do any, these are the ones to do first?
I mean, I think the full expensing is something which we at the Centre for Policy Studies, the IEA, other organisations have long campaigned on and think is a really, really important way of enhancing our productivity in particular and our productive performance. I think it would be close to the top of my list, except that I think that there's going to be a more generous approach being taken to capital allowances across the board anyway. So if that does some of the job in the short term, then that there is something to be said for that. I'd like to see a more blanket coverage. I'd like to see full expensing introduced as standard, but there are interim steps which the government won't see to take. So in that context, I think that there is what I really want to see is fresh new investment in the north, and we come up with something which is a little bit risky for a centre-right think tank such as ours, called the Triple I, an initial investment incentive. And the ambition there is to unlock international investment, people who are thinking, have globally mobile capital. It could be invested in the UK, it could be invested in mainland Europe, it could go somewhere else entirely, and give them a reason for investing in the north of England in particular, or in other parts of the UK that are in desperate need of levelling up. And the point of this incentive is to, in effect, just cut the marginal costs and do what, we talk about this in the report, do what Margaret Thatcher in particular did with Nissan in Sunderland in the 1980s, recognised that there was a competitive process going on and something needed to be put in place to ensure that the tilt was put in favour of the northeast of England, and we think the Triple I could do that. So I think in the next 3 to 4 years, if we had something like that applied in those parts of the country that need levelling up, it could make a huge amount of difference.
Fantastic. One last question actually links back to something you said right at the beginning. You're from the north of England, so am I, so is your co-author Jake Berry. We all ended up down here working in Westminster. Should we be aiming for a situation where people like us don't feel the need to move down to London and, are happy to stay in the north? Or do you think it's inevitable that some people are always going to want to move to the big city and some towns and villages are always going to suffer from, brain drain? I mean, it's not just north versus south. If we liberalised planning, for example, areas like Cambridge, which currently very high productivity regions, but with massive housing problems, they could benefit as well. Do you think we'll ever get to a stage where people don't all want to flood down to London, or do you think we just need to lessen the gap?
Yeah, I think one of the ironies of COVID is that some of that is perhaps been reversed anyway by accident. Jake, of course, spends plenty of his time up north because he's and spent most of his time in Rossendale when we were working on this. But I do think that will be a sign of success. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a understandable sort of instinct and tendency to come to London in particular and the southeast because it's, well, I was going to say perceived to be. I think it actually is where a lot of the jobs and the opportunities are, and success in many years to come would look like something where a lot of those jobs and opportunities were more evenly spread across the country. And I know the USA is a very different place for lots of very obvious geographic reasons, but I always think these sort of pockets of excellence scattered across the country is just such an appealing thing, and it doesn't even have to be in as big a country as that. Look at Germany, and it's got strengths in Stuttgart, in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in Hamburg, in North Rhine-Westphalia. I mean, these are all like great places to live that have their own individual strengths, and we have those individual strengths in the UK, but the magnetism and the domineering effect of London South East is something very, very unusual, and there's a whole range of factors behind that. And and the sorts of solutions we put forward will solve some of those, but not all of them, and it requires quite a lot of thinking about.
Great. I mean, yeah, you're right to point out, actually coronavirus is taking the shine off London a little bit as well. When it comes to levelling up, we may be doing it accidentally as much as on purpose. Thanks very much for joining us, Nick. Viewers and listeners, if you have your own ideas about how to drive growth and investment in left behind regions of Britain, we want to know about it. The Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize is offering a £50,000 top prize for the pro-market, pro-enterprise policy that would supercharge growth, employment and living standards in left behind Britain. The competition has a two-stage entry process, the first of which only requires 500 to 1,000 words on your idea. So don't delay. The deadline to enter is Tuesday, the 2nd of March. For more information and to submit your idea, you can visit breakthroughprize.org.uk. Thanks to Nick for joining me. Thanks to all for watching and listening. And thanks to the IEA supporters who help make our work possible. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London. Follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And you can subscribe to the IEA podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean. If you want to read Nick's report, I will link to it in the show notes, or you can find it on the CPS website, which is cps.org.uk.